It is hard to imagine a moment in history when the fate of the entire human species hung by a thread. Yet that moment came, and it nearly erased us from existence. Picture a world without cities, without nations, without even the concept of history as we know it. The Earth was a harsh, unpredictable place, ruled by the relentless rhythms of ice and fire. Survival was not a matter of comfort, but of raw instinct. And among the countless species struggling to endure, there was one fragile branch of life that would one day become us. But in this ancient age, that branch was on the brink of snapping forever. For many years, scientists believed that our closest brush with extinction came about 74,000 years ago, with the eruption of the Toba supervolcano in what is now Indonesia. This was no ordinary eruption. Imagine a blast so powerful it could hurl ash high into the atmosphere, darkening the skies for years, smothering entire regions under layers of volcanic debris, and cooling the planet by several degrees. According to earlier theories, the Toba eruption reduced early human populations to just a few thousand survivors, scattered and struggling in a dim, freezing world. It was thought that our species, or at least our direct ancestors, teetered on the very edge of oblivion. But the truth, as it turns out, is even stranger and far more ancient. New discoveries have revealed that the Toba disaster, devastating as it was, did not bring us to the brink. Early humans living in Africa at the time managed to endure. Archaeological evidence shows that life continued in certain regions. Stone tools kept being made, food kept being gathered, and the chain of survival remained unbroken. The real crisis, the true moment when our ancestral line almost ended forever, lay hundreds of thousands of years further back in time. Around 900,000 years ago, the human story took a terrifying turn. This was an era when our lineage was still far from becoming Homo sapiens. The world was populated by various early human species, scattered across Africa, Europe, and Asia. And then, something happened. Something so severe that it reduced our breeding population to a shockingly small number, about 1,280 individuals. To put that in perspective, it's like taking the entire human race and squeezing it into the size of a small village. And this was not a brief disaster. This state of near extinction, known as a population bottleneck, lasted for an astonishing 117,000 years. For more than 100 millennia, the survival of our kind hung in the balance. What could have caused such a prolonged and brutal collapse? The answer lies in a dramatic shift in Earth's climate, the mid-Pleistocene transition. Before this period, ice ages came and went in relatively short, predictable cycles of around 41,000 years. But the mid-Pleistocene transition changed the rhythm of the planet itself. Ice ages grew longer and more intense, lasting about 100,000 years at a time. Winters became harsher, summers cooler, and global weather patterns turned increasingly unstable. These climate changes brought devastating droughts to some areas, crushing cold to others, and unpredictable swings in temperature that made survival a constant gamble. For our ancestors, who had not yet mastered the use of fire, the impact was catastrophic. Without the ability to generate heat on demand, they were at the mercy of the cold. Their shelters, if they had any, were primitive at best. Food sources vanished as plants failed to grow in the bitter chill, and the animals they hunted migrated or died out. Starvation became a common enemy, and the loss of consistent nutrition weakened bodies, made childbirth more dangerous, and left communities more vulnerable to disease. But the challenges were not purely physical. Harsh climates and dwindling numbers also eroded cultural knowledge. Whatever skills, tools, or techniques had been passed down through generations were in constant danger of being lost as small, isolated groups died out. In those days, survival knowledge was not written down. It lived only in the memories and habits of the living. Every death carried the risk of erasing some vital skill forever. And as their numbers shrank, the ability to share and preserve knowledge grew ever more fragile. Yet, against all odds, those few thousand ancestors did not vanish. They adapted. They moved in search of food and shelter, following the herds and the changing seasons. They endured injury, disease, and hunger. They weathered storms that would have flattened the unprepared. For generation after generation, they held on, sometimes barely, clinging to life in an unforgiving world. And then, at some point in this long struggle, came a breakthrough that would change everything: the mastery of fire. We cannot know the exact moment it happened. Perhaps lightning struck a dry tree, igniting a blaze that a group of early humans dared to approach. Perhaps they learned, by accident or by desperate experimentation, how to coax sparks from stone. However it happened, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Fire was warmth in the freezing night. It was protection from predators whose eyes glowed in the dark. It was the power to cook food, making it safer, easier to digest, and far more nourishing. It was light in the darkness, stretching the waking hours and creating new spaces for communication, planning, and connection. With fire, they could push into colder regions. They could preserve meat for longer, gather around flames to share stories, and develop bonds that strengthened their communities. It was more than just a tool. It was the foundation for culture, language, and cooperation. Fire didn't just keep them alive. It gave them the means to grow, to recover, and to eventually thrive. These survivors, that tiny, stubborn remnant of humanity's past, would go on to evolve into Homo heidelbergensis, a species that became the common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and ultimately Homo sapiens. Every human alive today carries within their DNA the legacy of that ancient struggle. We are here because they endured. We are the product of their resilience, their adaptability, and their refusal to let the story end. They did not know they were making history. For them, every day was a battle for the present moment, to wake up alive, to find enough to eat, to make it through another night. But with the newfound control of fire, their odds of survival shifted. For the first time, they could challenge the cold on their own terms. They could linger in one place a little longer without fear of freezing. They could warm their children, soften tough roots to make them edible, and drive away predators whose instincts told them to avoid the glow of flames. It must have felt like a kind of magic, though they had no words for such ideas. Still, life was far from easy. The world they inhabited was not the one we know today. Great ice sheets advanced and retreated across continents, swallowing landscapes whole before retreating again, leaving behind barren plains. Forests shrank in the cold and spread in the warmth, forcing humans to constantly adapt their hunting and gathering strategies. Rivers that once teemed with fish could dry up in a few seasons, and lush valleys could turn into frozen wastelands. There was no certainty, no safety net, no storage of excess food for the future. Every gain was temporary, and every comfort could be torn away without warning. The small, scattered human groups of this era likely knew little of each other. Distances were vast, and without maps or the concept of distant travel for trade, most people lived their entire lives within a familiar stretch of land, bound by rivers, mountains, or the paths of migrating animals. If another band of humans appeared, it might be an opportunity for cooperation, but it could just as easily lead to conflict over scarce resources. Trust was a fragile thing in a world where every stranger was a potential threat. Yet even in this fragile state, something remarkable began to take root. Around those campfires, in the glow and warmth, humans found space for something beyond mere survival. They could sit together after a day's hunt, watch the sparks drift into the dark sky, and perhaps begin to communicate in ways more complex than before. Maybe they used sounds and gestures to share hunting strategies, to warn about dangers, to pass on stories of the past. Over time, these moments would lay the foundation for language itself, the tool that would one day allow humans to share knowledge across generations without fear of it being lost. But nature had no mercy. Even as these advancements unfolded, the climate continued its harsh cycles. An ice age could last for tens of thousands of years, and in its grip, the world would be locked in cold and scarcity. The humans who lived through these times were likely lean, muscular from constant movement, with bodies shaped by the demands of hunting, climbing, and enduring extreme conditions. Illness could strike without warning, and with no medicine beyond herbal remedies or instinctive care, survival depended on the resilience of the body and the care of the group. Predators were an ever-present danger. Lions twice the size of modern ones prowled the plains, and saber-toothed cats could ambush from the shadows. Packs of hyenas and wolves followed herds just as humans did, competing for the same prey. Even during the day, the open plains offered little shelter from these threats. At night, without fire, humans were no more than prey themselves. The fire was a shield, but its protection extended only as far as its flickering light. It is easy to think of these early humans as primitive, but in truth, their survival required a deep intelligence, not the kind measured in books or schools, but the kind honed by necessity. They had to read the land, understand the behavior of animals, and sense the changing seasons before they arrived. They had to craft tools from stone, bone, and wood, shaping them with precision so that a spear would fly straight or a scraper could clean a hide without wasting its warmth. Every tool was a product of skill passed down from countless generations, refined through trial and error, born from the urgency of survival. Slowly, painfully, the population began to recover, not in leaps and bounds, but in small victories measured over centuries. Children lived long enough to grow into hunters and gatherers themselves. Communities managed to see more births than deaths, and the fragile chain of survival grew a little stronger with each passing generation. It would take tens of thousands of years before their numbers truly began to grow, but the pattern was set: resilience, adaptation, and an unyielding will to endure. In this long age of struggle, the seeds of our modern humanity were being planted. Every challenge shaped us. Harsh winters favored those who could plan ahead. Scarce food taught the value of sharing and cooperation. Dangerous predators rewarded courage and quick thinking. And in the background, evolution worked silently, generation after generation, refining bodies and minds to meet the demands of an unforgiving planet. We often think of history as something recorded in writing, but the truest history is written in our DNA. In the very cells of our bodies, we carry the story of this near extinction. The scars of that bottleneck are still visible in our genetic makeup, a reminder that we all descend from a small band of survivors who walked the earth almost 1,000,000 years ago. Without them, there would be no us. No languages, no art, no cities, no history. Just another vanished species, remembered only by the stones and bones left behind. Yet they did not vanish. They endured long enough to evolve into something new, a species better suited to the world's challenges, with broader shoulders for carrying the weight of survival and sharper minds for solving its problems. In time, they would give rise to multiple human lineages, each adapting to its environment in different ways. Some would thrive for hundreds of thousands of years before fading into extinction. Others would carry forward the spark of life that began in that long-ago struggle. And though they could not have known it, those ancient survivors were setting the stage for everything to come, from the first true language to the first works of art, from the taming of the land to the building of civilizations. All of it began here, in the cold, in the dark, with a handful of humans refusing to surrender to a hostile world. Though the world was still a dangerous and unpredictable place, these early humans were slowly learning to bend it to their needs. Fire was no longer just an accident of nature. It was becoming a deliberate tool. Some groups may have learned to preserve embers from one fire to the next, carrying them in bundles of dried grass or bark, ensuring that their most valuable resource was never lost. Others may have begun to experiment with different types of wood, discovering which burned longer, which gave more heat, and which produced smoke that kept biting insects away. Such knowledge was precious, and those who possessed it became the anchors of their communities. Their stone tools were also evolving. Simple sharp flakes, once used just for cutting meat, were being refined into scrapers for hides, pointed tips for spears, and choppers for breaking bones to reach the rich marrow inside. The ability to make tools meant the ability to adapt, to fashion new solutions for new problems as they arose. A broken spear tip could mean the difference between catching a meal and going hungry, so knowing how to repair or replace it was as vital as knowing how to hunt in the first place. The animals of this era were both a source of sustenance and a constant threat. Herds of mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison roamed the land, offering immense rewards for those skilled enough to bring one down. But the hunt was never simple. Large prey fought back, and a single mistake could cost a hunter their life. Even when successful, the kill attracted scavengers. Packs of wolves might linger just beyond the circle of firelight, waiting for their chance to snatch a share. Hyenas could appear from the darkness, bold enough to challenge humans for their hard-won food. And in certain regions, saber-toothed cats stalked silently, their elongated fangs built for delivering a killing bite. In such a world, vigilance was as important as skill. Communication was changing too. While we can only guess at the sounds they used, it's likely these early humans had a growing set of vocalizations and gestures to coordinate hunts, warn of danger, or share discoveries. Over time, these primitive forms of communication may have evolved into more structured proto-languages, laying the groundwork for the spoken words that would one day bind human societies together. Around the fire at night, they may have told stories, not in the way we think of stories today, but through shared memories, mimicry, and demonstration. They might show younger members how to stalk prey by acting it out, or warn of predators by imitating their calls. These were not mere entertainments. They were lessons wrapped in memory, passed from one generation to the next. The climate still dictated much of their fate. Some years brought relative abundance, milder winters, good rainfall, and plentiful game. In such times, communities could grow, children could be born and raised with less hardship, and knowledge could flourish. But when the ice returned in force, when the winds turned bitter and food grew scarce, the population would suffer. Many would perish, and those who survived would carry the memory of loss. That cycle repeated for millennia, shaping their endurance like a blacksmith hammering steel. It is likely that in these ages, humans were far more nomadic than later societies. Staying in one place for too long could exhaust its resources. They followed the herds, moved to where wild plants ripened, and sought shelter in caves or natural rock overhangs when the weather turned harsh. Every relocation was a gamble. A new territory might hold promise, but it could also bring them into conflict with other groups or expose them to unknown dangers. Still, the instinct to move was essential. It was how they avoided starvation and kept ahead of the changing seasons. While the total human population was still painfully small, it had the advantage of being spread across multiple regions. This distribution meant that a single disaster in one area, a prolonged drought, a harsh winter, or a volcanic eruption, would not necessarily wipe out the entire species. Instead, survival depended on the delicate balance between isolation and occasional contact. Too much isolation could lead to inbreeding and a loss of genetic diversity, weakening future generations. Too much contact in times of scarcity could lead to conflict and death. Somehow, our ancestors managed to walk that narrow line, and through it all, evolution was shaping them. Physical changes were subtle over thousands of years, but profound over hundreds of thousands. Their brains were growing in size and complexity, allowing for more sophisticated thought and problem-solving. Their bodies adapted to the demands of their environment. Strong legs for long-distance walking, powerful arms for throwing spears, hands capable of delicate work with tools. Every trait that increased their chances of survival was passed on, becoming part of the blueprint for the humans that would follow. We can imagine the quiet moments, too. Moments that reveal the humanity we recognize in ourselves. A mother holding her child close by the fire, offering warmth and comfort against the cold night air. Hunters returning with food, greeted with relief and gratitude by those who had waited. The shared silence of a group staring at the stars, perhaps wondering, in their own way, about their place in the world. These were the beginnings of something more than mere survival. They were the beginnings of culture, identity, and the shared bonds that would one day give rise to civilizations. Their journey was far from over. The challenges ahead would be just as brutal, the threats just as real. But in surviving this long bottleneck, they had already achieved something extraordinary. They had proven that even in the most hostile conditions, a small, determined group could endure. They had carried the torch of life through an age when it could have been extinguished forever, and without realizing it, they were preparing the way for all who would come after them, for us. The millennia rolled on, each generation born into a world that seemed timeless in its dangers and demands. The ice would come, the ice would go, and the people would adapt as they always had. For the young, survival was not a lesson to be learned, but the very air they breathed. They knew from the first steps they took that the earth could be cruel, and that every day's safety was bought through vigilance, skill, and the collective effort of the group. Even in times of relative abundance, life was a delicate balance. The death of a skilled hunter could leave a group struggling to find food. A broken leg, an infected wound, or a sudden illness could mean the end for someone in a matter of days. There were no medicines beyond herbs, no doctors beyond the wisdom of elders who had seen such injuries before. And yet, there was care, not just the cold necessity of keeping a body alive, but a shared sense of responsibility that went beyond survival. They nursed the injured, they fed the sick, they watched over children and the old. The instinct to protect each other was not a luxury. It was the glue that kept them from collapsing entirely. Fire remained the heartbeat of their nights. Around its warmth, they crafted tools and weapons, sharpened blades on stones, and mended bindings made of animal sinew. Children would watch closely, their young minds absorbing the shapes, the motions, the patterns, long before their hands were steady enough to copy them. This was education in its earliest form, not through words carved into stone or written on parchment, but through sight, memory, and the repetition of 1,000 small tasks. The more they used fire, the more its potential unfolded. Roasting meat made it easier to chew and digest, freeing up energy for the brain. Heating stones allowed them to crack tougher bones for marrow or to create sharper edges on their tools. Smoke could drive pests from their shelters or preserve meat for leaner times. And perhaps, without realizing it, they were beginning to alter their own evolution. The extra calories from cooked food, the protection from predators, the warmth that reduced death from cold. All of these factors improved their chances of living long enough to reproduce, passing their hard-earned advantages on to the next generation. Still, they lived in the shadow of forces far beyond their control. The mid-Pleistocene climate cycles were relentless, and a sudden shift could turn a stable habitat into a barren stretch of land in a matter of years. Some groups vanished entirely, their traces lost to time. Others were forced to move, leaving behind familiar hunting grounds for unknown territories. This constant motion, this endless seeking, became part of the human way of life. It honed their resourcefulness, made them skilled at reading the signs of the earth and sky, and prepared them for journeys they could never have imagined. Occasionally, two groups might meet, strangers bound by the same struggle. These encounters could end in bloodshed or in the cautious exchange of goods, mates, and knowledge. It's likely that these rare interactions played a critical role in keeping the species alive, preventing genetic isolation and spreading ideas from one small population to another. Even a single meeting between bands could ripple through generations, introducing a new hunting method, a better tool design, or a fresh source of genetic strength. And so the human story during this bottleneck was not one of steady growth, but of survival in pulses, moments of stability followed by sudden trials. A season of plenty could be shattered by a harsh winter. A safe territory could be lost to a fire, a flood, or a rival predator. In those times, the difference between survival and death was often measured in the smallest details. Knowing when to follow migrating herds, which plants could be eaten without harm, or how to find shelter from the wind. We might imagine that life in such a world was joyless, but that would be a mistake. Even in the harshest environments, humans have always found moments to celebrate. A successful hunt would be met with satisfaction, and perhaps even shared excitement. The first fruits of a season, the birth of a child, the return of a loved one from a dangerous journey. These were victories worth marking, however simply. Laughter would have echoed in those camps just as it does in ours, for humor is as much a survival tool as fire, easing tension and strengthening bonds. The generations that endured during this age were not only physically resilient but mentally adaptable. They learned to expect change, to face uncertainty without paralysis, and to make decisions under pressure. These were the mental muscles that would serve their descendants when the world began to change yet again. For eventually, the long, slow grind of this bottleneck would end. Populations would grow, climates would shift once more, and humanity would take its next steps toward becoming the species that would one day shape the Earth. But in this long middle chapter, when survival was still a daily gamble, the groundwork for everything was being laid. These ancient humans may not have known they were carrying the future on their shoulders, but in every choice they made, to tend the fire, to share food, to teach a skill, to risk the hunt, they were ensuring that the line would not be broken. Without them, the story would have ended here. Instead, it was only beginning. As the centuries passed, small changes began to accumulate in the way these humans lived. The mastery of stone tool-making grew more refined, with sharper edges, more balanced shapes, and an increasing understanding of which rocks could be shaped without shattering. Flint, obsidian, and chert became prized resources when they could be found, valued not only for their utility but for the lifeline they represented. A good blade could mean a successful hunt or a safe defense against a predator. The ability to make one was as valuable as any physical strength. The hunt itself was evolving. Instead of relying solely on ambush or brute force, early humans began to develop strategies that required coordination and planning. They learned to work as a team, driving animals toward traps or ambush points, using the terrain to their advantage. Some prey were too large or dangerous to attack head-on, so they were weakened first, driven over long distances until exhaustion made them vulnerable. These hunts could take hours, even days, requiring endurance, patience, and a deep knowledge of animal behavior. Gathering plants and other resources was just as vital, though often less celebrated in our imagination. The women, elders, and younger members of the group played a crucial role in finding edible roots, berries, nuts, and seeds, as well as materials for tools, shelters, and fire-making. They knew which plants could soothe a wound, which ones could poison a man, and which ones would only be edible after boiling or roasting. This knowledge, passed down through generations, was an invisible thread holding communities together. For a group could survive without a single large hunt if it had enough gathered food, but even one mistake in foraging could be fatal. Travel remained a constant part of life. Even in the best of times, resources in one area would eventually be exhausted, forcing groups to move on. Their paths were often shaped by the movements of large herds, the growth cycles of plants, and the seasonal changes in weather. They crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and navigated forests, learning to recognize landmarks and the signs of familiar terrain. Some groups may have returned to the same spots year after year, finding them reliable, while others wandered farther, never settling in one place long enough to make it a home. Encounters with other human groups were unpredictable. Sometimes they were opportunities to share knowledge, exchange resources, or find mates, strengthening the genetic health of both communities. At other times, they could turn violent, competition for territory or food could flare into conflict quickly. In a world with so few humans, every encounter had weight. A meeting could shape the fate of a group for generations to come, for better or for worse. The climate continued to impose its will. Winters could come early and stay long, freezing rivers and blanketing the land in snow, cutting off access to food and water. Summers might bring drought, cracking the earth and driving animals away in search of better grazing. Storms could destroy shelters in a single night, forcing entire groups to rebuild or move on. There was no permanence, no guarantee of safety. The only constant was the need to adapt, again and again, to whatever the earth demanded. Yet through these cycles of hardship and brief abundance, humans were developing something unique, a memory that extended beyond the individual. Elders could remember past seasons of scarcity and guide their groups to places where food had been found before. They could warn against repeating mistakes, teach how to recognize signs of coming weather changes, and pass down the stories of great hunts or narrow escapes. These memories, shared and preserved through storytelling, became a kind of map in time, guiding the present with the lessons of the past. Firelight was often the stage for these exchanges. After the day's work was done and the night pressed in, people would gather close to the flames, their faces lit by its flicker, their voices carrying into the darkness. They might demonstrate the use of a new tool, mimic the movements of a hunted animal, or act out the events of a dangerous journey. Such moments were more than just teaching. They built unity, a shared sense of identity that made the group stronger. In a life where every day was a struggle, these bonds could be as important as any weapon. Over time, these early humans were not just surviving, they were adapting in ways that made them more capable of facing the world's challenges. Their bodies were strong, their senses sharp, and their minds increasingly skilled at problem-solving. They had learned not only how to endure hardship, but how to anticipate it. Each generation carried forward the hard-earned wisdom of the last, adding to it, refining it, and passing it along. It was slow progress, measured not in years but in lifetimes, yet it was shaping the path toward the humans we would eventually become. And still, the bottleneck continued. The population was growing, but so slowly that from one lifetime to the next, there may have been little visible change. The world remained vast and dangerous, and their numbers were too small to make it feel anything but empty. They were like scattered sparks in the dark, fragile, far apart, but refusing to go out. What they could not know was that the patience of time was on their side, and the skills they were honing in this age would one day carry their descendants to every corner of the earth. The days of these ancient humans were defined by necessity, but within that necessity, a rhythm began to form. There was the constant cycle of searching, gathering, hunting, and moving, but also the quieter moments, sharpening tools in the glow of morning light, mending hides as the sun set, tending to children while keeping a wary eye on the horizon. Every task was purposeful, every action tied in some way to survival, yet over time, repetition gave life a kind of structure. This was not civilization, not in any way we would recognize today, but it was the seed of something that would one day grow into it. Hunting had become more than a test of strength or speed. It was a test of planning and cooperation. Large prey required coordination, with each person in the group playing a role, driving the animals toward narrow passes or over embankments, waiting in ambush with spears ready, or blocking escape routes. The success of the hunt was shared, and so too was its failure. If a hunt went badly, the group might go hungry for days, which could lead to desperate measures, such as risking a dangerous predator's kill or scavenging from carcasses that might already be rotting. The line between bravery and necessity was razor-thin, and sometimes crossing it meant life, while other times it meant death. Gathering was equally critical, though it demanded a different kind of knowledge. Foragers needed to recognize plants in every stage of growth, remember where they grew, and know when they would be ready to harvest. Some plants were edible only after careful preparation, and others could heal wounds or soothe sickness when used properly. Mistakes were costly. The wrong root or berry could bring illness or even death. This knowledge was built over countless generations, carved into memory and passed on through careful instruction, especially to the young who would one day take up the responsibility of feeding the group. Fire remained at the center of their lives, but its role was growing beyond warmth and cooking. The light it gave allowed work to continue after the sun had set, extending the day and offering time for tasks that could not be done in darkness. It was a shield that pushed back the night, creating a small circle of safety in a world that belonged to predators once the sun went down. The flames became a gathering point, a place where the day's efforts came together. Food prepared and shared, tools repaired, stories told. Without fire, their world was a shifting shadow full of unseen dangers. With it, they carved out a place of their own, however small. Predators still prowled at the edge of that light. Hyenas, wolves, and great cats watched from the darkness, their patience measured in heartbeats. The humans knew they could never let the fire die while the night was still deep, for in that moment of weakness, the predators would strike. This vigilance was second nature, and perhaps it fostered a constant awareness, a way of seeing the world as a place where danger could emerge from any direction at any time. This mindset would be passed on, hardwired into the instincts of future generations. The climate remained the ultimate force shaping their fate. Ice ages rolled in and receded in long, punishing cycles. Rivers could swell with glacial melt one year and vanish into dry beds the next. Vast plains could turn to tundra, forests to barren stretches of rock. In these shifts, food sources moved, sometimes vanishing entirely. Adaptation was the only option, and those who could not adjust to new realities quickly enough simply did not survive. The survivors were not always the strongest, but they were often the most resourceful. Those who could think differently, who could see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. Movement was still the essence of survival. They traveled along ridgelines to spot game, followed the winding paths of rivers for water, and crossed open plains at great risk to reach the promise of greener land beyond. Each journey carried unknown dangers, rival groups, treacherous terrain, storms that could strip away their fragile shelters. Yet they moved on, for staying in one place too long was a death sentence. The land could provide only so much before it had to be left to recover, and the rhythm of migration became as natural to them as the changing seasons. Some encounters with other human bands brought new ideas. A different way of shaping a blade, a more efficient hunting method, a new plant to forage. Such exchanges, rare though they were, might ripple through a group for years to come. Other encounters ended badly, with blood spilled over access to water or hunting grounds. In both cases, the meetings shaped the flow of knowledge and survival strategies, slowly knitting together the scattered threads of humanity across distant lands. Even in the midst of hardship, moments of connection and meaning found their place. A child's laughter at play near the fire, the thrill of a successful hunt after days of hunger, the relief of reaching shelter before a storm. These moments were as vital to their spirit as food and water were to their bodies. It was in such moments that bonds deepened, and those bonds were what held them together when the world grew hostile. For countless generations, they walked this line between survival and extinction. Each life was a link in a chain stretching back into deep time, and though none of them could see the future, each one carried it forward in their own small way. They were building something without knowing it, a way of thinking, of planning, of working together, that would one day set their kind apart from every other creature on Earth. The bottleneck would not last forever, and when it ended, those traits would be the keys to everything that followed. The slow climb out of the bottleneck was so gradual that no single generation could have noticed it. To them, life remained the same, a struggle that demanded constant alertness, constant movement, constant adaptation. Yet over thousands of years, small victories began to add up. Groups that once numbered only a handful of families began to grow slightly larger. Infants survived to childhood more often. Hunters returned more frequently with food. The spark of life, so close to being extinguished, was beginning to flare again, however faintly. Fire, which had once been a fragile and precious discovery, was now a deeply ingrained part of human life. They not only kept it, but learned to create it when needed, perhaps by striking stones together to send sparks into dry tinder, or by twisting a stick rapidly in a notch of wood until friction brought forth smoke and flame. The ability to make fire on demand was a monumental step. It freed them from depending on natural sources like lightning or volcanic activity. With this skill, they could bring light and heat anywhere, at any time, a mastery that widened the boundaries of where they could live. This freedom encouraged bolder exploration. Humans began to test the limits of their range, pushing into territories that had once been too cold or too risky. They followed river valleys into unfamiliar lands, crossed open plains in search of new hunting grounds, and ventured into forests thick with unknown life. Each step into new territory carried risk, not only from predators or the elements, but from the possibility that the land might not sustain them at all. Yet curiosity and necessity pushed them forward. This constant movement, driven by the need to survive, slowly spread humanity across a greater portion of the world. Their technology, still made mostly of stone, bone, and wood, was steadily improving. Spear points became more refined, edges sharper, and hafting. The process of attaching stone blades to wooden shafts made weapons sturdier and more reliable. With better tools came better hunting, and with better hunting came more reliable food. This, in turn, supported population growth, creating a fragile but crucial upward spiral. Communication was likely advancing too, even if in ways we can only imagine. The coordination required for large-game hunts suggests a more complex system of signals and sounds, possibly even early forms of spoken language. Around the fire, they may have shared not just immediate plans but stories of the past, lessons disguised as tales, warnings wrapped in memory. Storytelling may have been the bridge between generations, ensuring that vital knowledge was not lost when elders passed away. Predators still roamed, and the humans of this era would have had to constantly defend themselves and their food. But with growing skill and better weapons, the balance of power was shifting. No longer merely prey, humans were becoming competitors, dangerous ones. They learned to work together to drive predators away from a kill, to defend their territory, and to strike back when threatened. The firelight at night was no longer just a shield. It was a declaration that they would not yield the darkness without a fight. Seasons of plenty still alternated with seasons of scarcity, but the humans were becoming better at anticipating these shifts. They began to store food when they could, drying meat over the fire, keeping nuts and seeds in woven containers, using smoke to preserve fish and game. Though these storage methods were primitive, they marked an important change in thinking. The ability to plan not just for the next day, but for weeks or even months ahead. This foresight was a survival skill as important as any spear. The growing mastery of the environment was not only physical but mental. Humans began to see patterns in the world, the migration routes of animals, the flowering times of plants, the signs of coming storms. Recognizing these patterns allowed them to prepare for what was coming instead of simply reacting when it arrived. This shift in mindset, from reacting to anticipating, was one of the quiet revolutions of human evolution. Yet the dangers were never far away. A single bad hunting season could still mean starvation. A storm could destroy shelter, a disease could sweep through a group, or a sudden shift in climate could force them to abandon familiar territory. These moments reminded them that survival was never guaranteed. The lessons were written not in words, but in the lives lost, the hard decisions made, and the memory of what it took to endure. And so, generation after generation, they pressed on. Each step forward was built on the hardships of those who came before. Theirs was not a story of swift triumph, but of relentless endurance, of learning to make a place for themselves in a world that offered no easy paths. The bottleneck was loosening, but its shadow still hung over them. Only through persistence, adaptation, and the unbreakable bonds of their communities would they finally emerge from its grip. The slow expansion of humanity's range brought them into landscapes unlike any they had known before. Rolling grasslands gave way to dense forests, where sunlight filtered in thin beams through tangled canopies. In some regions, they found broad rivers teeming with fish. In others, wind-swept plains where herds of grazing animals moved in endless cycles. Each new environment demanded adjustments, different tools, different hunting strategies, different ways of building shelter. The humans who thrived were those who could read the land quickly, learning its rhythms and hazards before it could claim their lives. In the forests, hunting required silence and patience. The prey here was often smaller, faster, and more difficult to track. Hunters learned to move softly over leaf litter, to follow faint trails through undergrowth, and to use the terrain for concealment. In the open plains, it was speed and coordination that mattered most, using the vastness of the land to corner or exhaust larger animals. Along rivers, fishing and trapping provided a new source of food, but also introduced dangers in the form of crocodiles, snakes, or sudden floods. In every case, survival meant not just adapting, but adapting quickly. As they explored, they encountered not only new challenges but also opportunities. New materials for tools, stones with sharper edges, plants with stronger fibers for binding, shells that could be shaped into cutting edges or used as containers, expanded their technological possibilities. In some places, they discovered natural shelters in the form of caves or rock overhangs, offering protection from the elements and predators alike. These spaces became gathering points, places where fires burned brighter and longer, and where markings, perhaps the earliest forms of symbolic expression, might begin to appear on the walls. The idea of home was still fluid. A group might occupy a favorable site for weeks or months, only to leave it behind when the resources waned. But each time they returned to such places, they brought with them memories of past hunts, past gatherings, past lessons learned there. These repeated returns, across generations, created invisible threads connecting people to particular landscapes, even in an age when nothing was truly permanent. Encounters with other groups became more common as human populations very slowly increased. Sometimes these meetings were tense, marked by watchfulness and distance. At other times, they were occasions for exchange, a new tool design shown in trade for a different food preparation method, or the offering of materials that were rare in one group's territory but plentiful in another's. The movement of these ideas was as important as the movement of people. It meant that a discovery made in one place could, over time, influence survival strategies in another hundreds of miles away. This gradual weaving of connections was fragile. In times of plenty, it could strengthen bonds between groups. In times of scarcity, it could dissolve into rivalry and conflict. When resources ran short, even former allies might become competitors. The lessons learned in these encounters were passed down as well. The wisdom of when to approach and when to avoid, the subtle signs that signaled danger or welcome. Meanwhile, the skills tied to fire continued to grow. It was no longer only a means of cooking or protection. It became a tool for shaping the land itself. Some groups may have learned to burn sections of grassland to encourage fresh growth, attracting grazing animals to hunt later. Others might have used smoke to drive bees from hives for honey, or to flush small animals from hiding. Each new use reflected a deeper understanding of how to bend the environment toward human needs, a shift that would eventually reshape entire landscapes. Even so, life in this age was never far from the edge. Illness could sweep through a group with little warning, and without medicine, survival depended on the body's own strength and the care of others. Injury was a constant risk. A fall from a rocky slope, a deep cut from a stone tool, a kick from a panicked animal could mean weeks of weakness or death if infection set in. Death was familiar, woven into the rhythm of life, yet it never lost its sting. The grief of loss was as real then as it is now. a weight carried in the hearts of the survivors. But there was joy, too, found in the rare abundance of a great hunt, the sweetness of ripe fruit after a long journey, the safe return of a hunting party, or the warmth of fire on a bitter night. These moments of triumph and comfort were the bright threads in a fabric woven mostly of hardship. They gave people reasons to endure, to push forward into another day. And so, the long, slow climb continued. The world was still vast and dangerous, the population still small and scattered, but the humans who lived through this era were no longer the same as those who had entered it. They were more skilled, more adaptable, and more connected to one another. The bottleneck that had nearly ended their story was loosening its grip, and though the path ahead would still be long, the foundation for survival was stronger than ever before. With each passing generation, the lessons of survival became more deeply embedded, not just in memory, but in instinct. Children were taught almost from the moment they could walk, how to read animal tracks in soft earth, how to find water in a dry landscape, how to keep their distance from certain plants and insects. Play was never just play. It was training. A child throwing pebbles at a target was practicing for the day they would throw a spear at a moving animal. A child following older members on foraging trips was learning the patterns of the land that could one day mean the difference between life and death. The act of teaching itself was evolving. It was no longer just about passing on tasks. It was about passing on ways of thinking. Elders, who had lived through multiple seasons of scarcity and plenty, shared not only what to do, but how to decide what to do. They spoke of the signs that preceded hard winters, of the sounds that meant predators were near, of the landmarks that would lead a lost traveler home. This layering of experience across lifetimes was slow, but it gave humans a depth of knowledge that no single individual could gather alone. In some regions, small technological leaps began to appear. Stone blades were shaped with greater precision, perhaps using softer stones or bone as tools to grind and sharpen edges. Spears were balanced more carefully for throwing, giving hunters the ability to strike from a safer distance. Simple carrying devices, woven plant fibers, hides fashioned into pouches, allowed for the transport of food and materials over longer journeys. These innovations might seem small, but in a world where a single day without food could weaken the body dangerously, they could mean survival where there would otherwise be death. Hunting strategies continued to diversify. Some groups learned to drive animals into natural traps, narrow gorges or marshy ground where escape was difficult, while others became experts at following a herd for days, wearing it down until its weakest members could be brought down. Fishing methods grew more varied too, with traps placed in shallow water and sharpened sticks used to spear fish from the banks. The diet of these humans was far broader than we might imagine, with plants, insects, small mammals, and even scavenged remains all part of their food sources. As their skill and confidence grew, so too did their willingness to explore. They crossed rivers they had once avoided, climbed higher into mountain ranges, and pushed deeper into forests. Some groups would return with tales, told not with words we would recognize, but through gestures, imitations, and demonstrations, of places where game was plentiful or water ran clear. These accounts could spark entire migrations, sending groups on journeys that would take them far from their original territories. The bond within each group was more than a convenience. It was the bedrock of survival. Alone, a human was vulnerable to predators, injury, or hunger. Together, they could share burdens, defend one another, and pool their skills. A skilled hunter relied on the gatherer, who knew which plants could heal wounds, just as the gatherer relied on the hunter, who could bring in meat for the fire. Trust was not just emotional. It was the currency that kept life moving forward. Fire still marked the center of these bonds. Around it, stories grew more elaborate. Hunts were planned, disputes were settled, and decisions were made. It was in the firelight that elders could point to a tool and explain its use, or a hunter could show how to track a wounded animal. It was also a place for comfort, for laughter, for song, perhaps even for the earliest forms of ritual. The fire was not just a tool now. It was part of their identity. Yet danger never vanished. Storms could sweep through without warning, scattering shelters and soaking the land, making firewood scarce. Floods could wash away entire camps. Disease could strike swiftly, and without understanding its causes, humans could only respond with care and hope. A sudden shortage of food could push a group into another's territory, and what began as a desperate search for survival could end in violence. These moments tested the bonds that had been built, forcing hard choices between risk and safety. Still, the momentum of survival was carrying them forward. Slowly, the scattered sparks of humanity were brightening, growing closer, and lighting more of the world. The great bottleneck had not broken completely, but the pressure was easing. Those who lived in this time could not know the scale of what they were achieving, but their persistence was rewriting the future. In their steady push against extinction, they were laying the final stones in the path out of the bottleneck and toward the wider story of humankind. As the bottleneck era moved toward its end, the world was still a place of uncertainty, but humanity was no longer quite so fragile. Their numbers were still small, yet each generation seemed to add just a little more to the collective strength of the species. A newborn's chances of survival were higher than in the darkest days, and more children lived long enough to have children of their own. Slowly, the line of humanity thickened, stretching farther into the future with each passing year. The mastery of fire and tools was now deeply woven into their way of life. No one needed to be convinced of their importance. They were as essential as water or shelter. Fire meant cooked food, warmth, and protection. Tools meant the ability to hunt larger prey, prepare hides for clothing, and shape wood and bone into implements that could make almost any task easier. Together, these skills formed a kind of shield against the unpredictable world. Even in this improving climate of survival, the humans did not become complacent. The land could still turn against them in an instant. Drought could turn rivers to cracked mud, forcing migrations over long distances. Harsh winters could drive prey away, leaving hunters to return empty-handed. Disease could still pass through a group like wildfire, taking the strong and the weak alike. These threats ensured that humans kept moving, kept watching, kept learning. In their travels, they reached places their ancestors might never have imagined. Some crossed into colder regions, their bodies and habits adapting to ice and snow. They learned to build sturdier shelters, to wrap themselves in furs, to hunt the animals of the frozen plains. Others ventured into warmer, wetter climates, where lush forests offered new foods, but also new predators and diseases. Every shift in environment demanded change, and those who survived became living proof of human adaptability. The connections between groups grew more significant. A chance meeting could lead to the exchange of not just resources but ideas. A better spear tip, a new way to start a fire, a plant unknown to one group but common to another. These exchanges carried knowledge across vast distances, sometimes over the course of many generations. The humans of this era were not a single community, but they were slowly becoming part of a wider network of shared survival. We can imagine that, over time, these interactions planted the seeds of a deeper awareness, that they were not entirely alone in the world. They may have begun to recognize the value in cooperation beyond the immediate family or hunting band. While conflict remained an ever-present risk, so too did the possibility of forming lasting alliances, however fragile, that could endure across seasons and years. The bottleneck had been a crucible, burning away weakness and leaving behind a species that could adapt to almost anything. They had learned to read the land, the weather, the behavior of animals. They had learned to make and improve tools, to control fire, to pass on knowledge in ways that allowed it to grow rather than fade. Most importantly, they had learned to depend on one another, understanding that their survival was not just an individual struggle but a shared one. From this foundation, the great branches of humanity would soon spread outward, into new lands, new climates, and eventually, new forms of life entirely. These survivors would give rise to Homo heidelbergensis, who in turn would become the ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and, eventually, Homo sapiens. The bloodlines of those who endured this age would flow into every corner of the human story that followed. They could not have known the scope of their achievement. To them, they were simply living as they always had, waking with the dawn, moving with the herds, keeping the fire alive through the night. But in surviving where so many might have perished, they carried forward the fragile thread of existence. They were the guardians of humanity's future, though they had no word for such a role. And so, the bottleneck closed behind them, not with a sudden victory, but with the slow, steady march of life pushing forward. Their resilience, their adaptability, and their will to endure would echo through hundreds of thousands of years, shaping a species that would one day stand on every continent, gaze at the stars, and remember, however faintly, that once, long ago, the world had tried to silence them, and they had refused to vanish.